The lawsuit is being filed today, and it's arguing that circumcision is a fraud. It would be a landmark case.
You're listening to The Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to legal expert Peter Adler about his work questioning whether or not circumcision is a fraud, and a landmark case being brought against the American Academy of Pediatrics based on that work. We also discussed the sales and persuasion tactics that doctors use to perpetuate this potential fraud, and the human rights case against circumcision. Now, here's Peter.
I'm Peter Adler, and I'm a lawyer and a law professor at University of Massachusetts.
So, Peter, what are the major papers that you've written that people might know you by?
The first one actually the second one I wrote, but I mentioned it first, is an article in 2013 asking, is circumcision legal? There had been legal scholars who argued that it wasn't, but I didn't fully understand what the theories were. So I researched that and wrote quite a long paper arguing, or I would say showing, that it is unlawful. In 2011, in the course of writing that article, I realized that Medicaid was paying for circumcision, but circumcision is unnecessary surgery. And I learned that the rule in Medicaid is that it doesn't pay for unnecessary surgery, and therefore it's unlawful to use it for physicians and hospitals to bill it, and actually fraudulent if they know they're not allowed to bill it for it, which they should know. So I wrote that paper. In 2013, there was a debate about the ethics and legality of circumcision, or lack thereof, between Steven Svoboda, founder and executive director of Attorneys for the Rights of the Child, and Dr. Michael Brady and Douglas Diekema from the American Academy of Pediatrics. That was an epic debate, and both sides of the debate published papers in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. So I helped Steven Svoboda prepare for the debate, although he certainly did the bulk of the work, including speaking for himself. And then we published a paper in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics, arguing that circumcision is unethical and unlawful. My next big paper was, is circumcision a fraud?, which I published in November of 2020, so just a few months ago, in the Cornell Journal of Law and Public Policy.
You know, one of the things I love about your papers is that a lot of academic writing has very long, vague titles that are somewhat complex and difficult to understand, but you have a very direct way of titling your papers. Is circumcision a fraud? Is circumcision legal? It's very clear the perspective that you're and the case you're trying to make. So I'm wondering, how is it that you began writing on this subject, and then what is the case that you make in those papers? Briefly.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you how I got involved in the circumcision movement. It really dates back to when my son was born in 1987. He was born at Brigham and Women's Hospital. It's a Harvard hospital, one of the best in the world. And my wife was nursing, and we were just having a happy time bonding with our newborn, when a doctor came into the room and said in a very loud voice, "Have you decided whether to have your son circumcised yet or not?" It's imprinted on my mind what he said, how he said it. He kept my wife out of the conversation. She was nursing. He didn't make any attempt to involve her. I tried to involve her, but she had just given birth on medications, was nursing, and was out of it. Anyway, to get to the point, he pitched circumcision to me and gave some arguments in favor of it. And one thing that he said is that some parents elect it for religious reasons. And then I said, I'm not religious. Then he said, some parents elect it for cultural reasons. And I said, I don't care what people in other cultures do. And then he said, some people elect it for personal reasons. And then he said, do you have any questions? And I said, yes. What do you mean personal reasons? And then he said, well, sometimes parents elect it so that the son's penis will look like the father's penis. And so that got me to thinking back to law school. And I realized that any medical procedure without permission, without consent of the person or permission of a legal representative is unlawful, and it's a battery. So he needs my permission. But what he told me seems very unlikely to be true. So I tried to think, well, if that were true, then a parent, if he or she wanted the child's ear to look like their ear and their ear was deformed, they could ask a doctor, well, cut his ear off or make it deform like my ear. That couldn't be possible. So it was really the fact that they had made what I later realized was a false legal claim that parents have that right, was what got me started learning more about circumcision. In other words, doubting it. Because if they had said one thing that was false, then what else was false?
By the way, is the phrasing that he used, have you decided that you want your son circumcised yet or not? Is that the exact phrasing?
Yes, the way I said it to you is the exact phrasing. And it's somewhat accusatory. It almost implies that you're a bad parent if you haven't made that decision yet.
Yeah. Well, what's so interesting to me about that is, so my wife and I are both trained in what's known as neurolinguistic programming or persuasion, conversational hypnosis. And that phrase has so much persuasion baked into it. It has the embedded command, you decided to circumcise, built into it. So have you decided to circumcise yet or not? And there's a false dichotomy at the end, and a little phrase that hides the command even more. And so it sounds to me like he was applying a lot of persuasion and salesmanship, whether he was aware of it or not. And that you, because you're a lawyer and you're someone who's very intelligent, were attuned to that and were able to see, wait a minute, this is salesmanship. This is not a medical discussion. And then he went to you as the customer and didn't even involve your wife, because his thinking is, well, this is where the sale is being decided.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. But I actually didn't figure out it was a sales job at that time. It was only later when I replayed the entire conversation, because he basically made a lot of arguments in favor of circumcision. And he said it has potential medical benefits. But here's the interesting part, Brendon, that he said, well, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, it reduces the incidence of urinary tract infections by 1%. But then he said, but that's not a reason to circumcise, because UTIs can be treated with antibiotics. So I scratched that off the list. He told me it wasn't justified for that reason.
Even so that phrasing, though, that's not a reason to do it. Like, it has the idea that it's a reason to do it built into it.
Exactly. So it took a long time for me to figure out, well, he made a sales pitch. It reduces the risk of urinary tract infections, which sounds like a bad thing. And then he said, but it's not justified for that reason. So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but the American Academy of Pediatrics has changed its position when it told people it was not justified for that reason. And he also told me it's not justified to reduce the risk of penile cancer, which is a rare disease in old age. Then he said it's not justified to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted diseases. He said that, people behavior causes sexually transmitted diseases, not the foreskin. And so he basically told me it's not justified medically. But of course, in the heat of the moment, I couldn't process everything. It took a really long time to realize that this is a high pressure sales pitch that physicians in hospitals put on parents. And as I indicated, the mothers have just given birth, often on medications, and they're nursing. They're not that I know anything about hormones, but they must be all completely out of balance. And I know my wife was, quote, out of it, meaning legally incapacitated, because I said to her, sweetheart, you're a doctor. This sounds important. I think you should be part of this conversation. And then she said, you have a penis, dear, you decide. And she has an MD and a PhD, and she's made every medical decision or help in our family since that day. And I'm certain that she was legally incapacitated. And physicians must know this because they are supposed to determine whether a patient has the capacity to consent when a patient is an adult and is being offered a service. They should know that the mothers are incapacitated. They target the mothers. Then they target the child because the child cannot say no. The child's just been born. It's completely trusting the parents and the doctor. And then they also target fathers by making this argument in effect that if you're circumcised, would you like your son's penis to look like yours? Which helps persuade people. So it took a long time to realize this is a big sales pitch, and the sales pitch involves both conduct, words, omissions, and implications, which I can go into that if you would like.
Sure. It's interesting to me too. I do want you to go into it, but I have a thought before we do, which is that it sounds like that in pitching this to you, the doctor had a sales pitch he uses usually, but did not calibrate it very well to you. So my wife and I, again, did a class on sales together. And one of the things we were learning is that when you meet someone, you have to figure out what their values are, what's important to them. And then also if there's anyone else involved in the decision. So for most people, the wife might not be involved, but for you, if your wife's a doctor, of course, you're going to involve her in a medical decision. Anyway, Peter is a very smart guy, but that's not a reason to listen to this entire podcast all the way through and then go subscribe. So just so you all know, I'm not saying that you should listen to everything he has to say today, but I'm curious what it is. You said that you later deconstructed it, and sort of what is the argument that you sort of found afterwards?
Yeah, it took me sort of 10 years to think all of this through. And, as background, I did not know there was any opposition to circumcision. Doctors don't tell you. They don't tell you it's controversial. There could be bloodstained men outside protesting against circumcision outside the hospital, and the parents wouldn't be told. And so I guess, as I said, I wrote this article, is circumcision legal or not? And I argued that it wasn't, but I still didn't realize the implications. The implications are that they're not allowed to perform it. So they're not allowed to pitch it. They're not allowed to offer it to parents, and parents aren't allowed to elect it either. So we've been talking about the conduct. I realized that the conduct in the hospital is designed to sell it. And then you say they didn't design the pitch very well for me. And I think the reason is there's a uniform pitch. There's a question they ask you, the one I told you, do you want to have your son circumcised or not? And then there's a talk. So you could call it a talk with a capital T. And the talk is whatever the American Academy of Pediatrics tells them to tell the parents. But doctors are part of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it isn't just a medical association, it's a trade association looking out for the finances of doctors. So
that really reframes the policy, because I think most people think of it as a medical policy statement, not the sales pitch or the script for a sales funnel.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Brendon. So I think the disconnect is that the American Academy of Pediatrics is supposed to be independent and issue guidelines based on science. But in fact, the members of the American Academy of Pediatrics have profound undisclosed conflicts of interest. So one is the financial interest they have in perpetuating profits of physicians. Another thing is that many of them are Jewish. And I mentioned I'm of Jewish origin myself. And many Jews believe that circumcision is commanded by their God, and they're desperate to preserve it. And so basically it's a case of foxes guarding the hen house. People who want to protect circumcision for religious and financial reasons come up with these guidelines, which aren't neutral at all.
So I know that a lot of people who are not aware of this issue or haven't thought about it as deeply as you have might push back and say, oh, maybe we don't need to do it anymore, but is it really a fraud? Is it really illegal? Because the implications of that are that one of the largest industries in the world is engaged in criminal misconduct. So maybe you could break down that case for us. Why is circumcision legal, or why is it or is it not?
All right, so let's start with, that question, is it legal or not? It's uncontested that it's unnecessary. It's a medical procedure. It cuts into tissue and removes or amputates it. So think of it as being like any other unnecessary surgery on an adult, if you want. That takes parents' religion out of the equation. Can a doctor operate on, an adult who's in a coma and cut off, part of his ear? I mean, obviously not. So why not? And this is why it took a long time to think this all through, but others have done it before me. But the basic idea, or a fundamental concept dating back to the English common law, that every person has a right to bodily integrity and self-determination. So the right to bodily integrity is the right to be left alone, free from all, from harm, from bodily injury, insults, punishments. So the implications are that almost any touching of another person is a case of assault. It's called prima facie. That means that the person who did it has to justify it. Otherwise, it is an assault. And so the concept then is the body is sacred, that people have the right to make their own decisions about their own bodies. The second part, the right to self-determination, is the right to autonomy, the right to make important decisions for yourself. So you have a right to be free from harm and to decide what is done with your body. So it's incontestable or obvious that circumcision is performed without the consent of the person being operated on. And children have the same rights as adults. These are called inalienable rights that go back to the common law of England, as written by Blackstone in commentaries in the 1600s. And the United States adopted the common law of England. So it adopted the concept of the right to bodily integrity and self-determination. There's a Supreme Court case in the 1800s that talks about this and says every person has a right to bodily integrity and self-determination. It's fundamental. The concept is that the body is sacred. There's a decision by the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts saying exactly the same thing. There's also, under international law, the Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the right to personal security, which is the same as bodily integrity and self-determination. The Dutch Constitution contains it. So many laws in the common law jurisdictions, the English-speaking countries and the civil law jurisdictions, they all have this. It's an absolutely fundamental concept in the law. So to cut another person's body without a valid medical reason is a battery. And so every person who is circumcised who was healthy, because if you think of it, Brendon, doctors declare the child healthy when they circumcise the newborn. They say, "You are perfectly healthy." And then they ask the parents, "Would you like to have your child circumcised?" And the parents usually elect it for reasons having nothing to do with medicine. And that's just simply not allowed. Doctors have to use their independent medical judgment to determine whether the circumcision is, or any procedure is necessary or not. Surgery is defined as, a necessary medical procedure to remove and destroy tissue when there's no other resort.
So if I'm understanding the summary of the argument, it is that there is a long series of law. There's a long tradition and series of case laws that say that people have the right to their own bodies, and that cutting off part of the body with no necessary reason, with it, the body being perfectly healthy, is a violation of that person's rights.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that battery is only one of the counts. So if you were bringing a lawsuit, you would have a count for battery, but there are other counts that you can bring as well.
So one of the things that I know that people might push back against that argument with is that even though this is true of other surgeries you might do on an infant, that circumcision has such a long historical tradition as well that it somehow exists outside laws that aren't necessarily recent, but recent to the last 300 years. In other words, there's sort of this cultural idea that circumcision exists outside those, or it's been going on so long. Like, yes, although that argument makes intellectual sense, but at the same time, people have this sort of visceral reaction of like, but you can't say that about this. And then there's also the question. Well, sorry, go ahead. I'll let you respond to that one first.
Well, embedded in your question is the view, correct, that people usually elect circumcision for reasons having nothing to do with medicine. And there's a Dr. Friedman of the American Academy of Pediatrics wrote an article saying that in 2016. It says parents don't usually choose to have their child circumcised to prevent urinary tract infections or the like. They usually elect it for religious, cultural, and personal reasons. So going back thousands of years, boys and girls have had parts of their genitalia cut off primarily for religious reasons around the world. But then once it became common, then it became a cultural phenomenon, a deeply embedded cultural norm. And then, as I've said, doctors also offer it up to parents for, quote, personal reasons. That is, do you have an aesthetic preference for the appearance of the circumcised penis? So these are powerful forces that people are unaware of. Thousands of years of circumcisions in the US going back to the 1850s. And so there's no reason for people to question it. They think it's medicine, but it began as a sacrificial religious ritual and a painful rite of passage. Slaves were circumcised to humiliate them. Foreskins were collected as prizes of war. Circumcision is an absolutely terrible thing. And doctors have tried to portray it as medicine when it is violence. And there's no defense for a doctor licensed to practice medicine who goes to medical school and learns when to diagnose illnesses and medical conditions and determine what's the best way to treat this. And the best way to treat any problem is not surgically. So if you cut your leg, you don't cut the leg off, you put a Band-Aid on it, or you use antiseptics. And
so I guess there's a follow-up question there then, of even though the argument makes intellectual sense and the surgery, if you can even call it that, is very brutal for children, how is it that you effectively make this legal argument in the culture that we have now? Because on the one hand, while it might make intellectual sense, and while there might be a very strong argument, making the argument theoretically and making it to a court or to a judge or in the culture that exists now is a very different thing. So I'm wondering how you take that argument from something that is merely intellectual to something that might actually create change.
Well, that's a very good question for you. So we've said it's a deeply embedded cultural norm, and we've said that doctors have a financial interest in perpetuating it. And the American Academy of Pediatrics Task Force on Circumcision has or committed itself in 2012 to sell it even more in the face of declining circumcision rates. For example, arguing that Medicaid should pay for it, even though Medicaid doesn't cover unnecessary surgery. So they didn't give any reasons for it. The argument is malarkey, but they make it anyway. So then you've alluded to another problem. Judges, if they're male, they're circumcised. And if they're female, they may have sons who are circumcised or husbands, or they may have consented to it. And people don't really want to be told that, they've made a mistake, that they've hurt their child. So there's a real problem in courts of judges not being neutral. I give an example and make it short, but in the Hieronymus case in Florida a couple of years ago, a mother had consented to have her son circumcised, but then she learned more about it and she changed her mind. So she wanted to stop it. The father wanted to have the son circumcised to spite the mother. This is quite common, called spite circumcisions. So the mother brought suit. A doctor testified that circumcision is not safe. It's painful and it risks more than 50 complications. It can be fatal and it can cause psychological harm. The doctor disregarded the testimony of the judge, disregarded the testimony of the doctor. And he said, I quote, "Circumcision is very, very safe." He might have had three verys. So he was wrong. And he put the mother in jail until she relented and consented to have her son circumcised, which is coercion, duress. Her consent was invalid. So what I'm saying, it was a crazy decision, but it was made by a judge who just didn't know that circumcision is a bad thing. So you have the problem that it's a deeply embedded cultural norm, and then you have the problem that doctors perform it and they try to justify it, and people don't know anything about medicine or the law, and so they don't know whether the medical claims are true or not, and they don't know whether it's true that it's illegal. They just don't know.
You know what it strikes me too is that when someone tried to sell you on circumcision, they used non-rational sales techniques. And it sounds like that a lot of judges have also been sold on circumcision through cultural beliefs that are also entirely non-rational. In other words, even though you might make a rational argument to them, it sounds like judges almost need to be sold on the arguments that you're making, even though they make complete rational sense.
So it's a very good insight, and it makes me think back to law school when we were told that the law follows society, that society has to change. And then once people change their view of something, then the law changes. So the law is a trailing indicator, but it's encouraging to intactivists that change is underway. So circumcision rates were almost 90% in the mid 1900s. And then now they've declined to about 55%, according to the CDC a couple of years ago. So you have declining circumcision rates. Another force that you have is more activists like the bloodstained men I mentioned, bringing attention to the fact that this is a bloody procedure that cuts off part of the penis in case people forgot. Then you have decisions in Europe by courts that have been publicized in the US. So the New York Times, for example, wrote about a decision in Germany holding that circumcision is unlawful, it's a crime, it's harmful, it violates the right of the child to bodily integrity and self-determination. and the child's rights supersede the parents' rights. So this is slowly coming into the consciousness of the country. And, opposition is rising, and there are more and more men who, as they learn what was taken from them, are upset and join this huge tent of activists, which was big when I joined it in 2010, and has gotten so much bigger from then. Marilyn Milos, the founder of the movement, at one of the conferences said, when she started it, the opponents of circumcision could meet in a room and she knew them all. And now she doesn't even know who they all are, but welcome. I do think, though, that circumcision lawsuits, they have been brought, and at one point soon, I think there will be an avalanche of lawsuits. There are already lawsuits for botched circumcisions. Attorneys for the Rights of the Child has a list of judgments, that some of them going up to, I think, $30 million. It's, can happen that the glands of the penis is cut off because clamps are used and doctors can't see underneath them, and doctors are not well trained, so they make lots of errors. Pediatric urological surgeons are kept busy trying to repair botched circumcisions, but once they're botched, it's hard to repair them. But
how
yeah.
common do you think botched circumcisions are?
Yeah, so if you want to know, is the American Academy of Pediatrics a task force on circumcision? Are they neutral? All you need to know is that they've said since 1975 that the incidence of circumcision complications is unknown. So they don't even try to find out the incidence of complications. And when they talk about the complication rate, they don't count complications after the operation and a few weeks thereafter. So if you're injured and you're an older man, they don't know about you. Also, I would say that the true complication rate is 100%. So that the American Academy of Pediatrics assigns no value to the foreskin. They've portrayed it, circumcision, as the painless, simple, painless, safe removal of a useless piece of skin. And all those things are false. They assign no value to the foreskin, even though men do.
So I'm also curious, though, what degree of circumcisions do you think have actionable legal botches? So there's obviously a subjective element to that, in the sense that because the surgery has no necessary thing that it's trying to accomplish, nothing that it's it's not necessary. So because of that, there's a subjective element to what is considered a botch, because the surgery itself could be considered a botch. But I'm wondering, what percentage of them do you think result in something that's legally actionable?
The expert in botched circumcisions would be David Llewellyn. A big part of his practice is suing for botched circumcisions, performed usually by physicians in hospitals, but also by moils and in the Jewish faith. So, what is the real complication rate? Well, I believe, I don't want to make up a number without looking it up, but the incidence of narrowing of the urethral opening is very high, somewhere 10 to 15% of all circumcisions. So that's a complication. Psychological harm, being angry that you were circumcised, that's a complication. But if you're asking how many are actionable, how many people could bring suit, the entire thrust of my articles is that everyone can bring suit, that it's inherently harmful. There was a case in California, Tortorella versus Castro, of unnecessary surgery, where the patient consented but wasn't told it was unnecessary. And the court said, it seems obvious that it is harmful to perform unnecessary surgery, and it's painful. It puts the patient at risk, and it's harmful to have part of your body cut off. And so in my view, every circumcised boy and man can bring suit for having been circumcised.
That's interesting, by the way, because it sounds like that court had not been sold on many of the cultural myths about this issue. And so it sounds like that they were much more open to the obvious rational truth in the argument.
Sorry, Brendon, are you talking about the Hieronymus case in
The one that you just mentioned, in which a court said that it seems obvious that unnecessary surgery is harmful.
Oh, I see. Excuse me. Yes. So, I mean, I think it is obvious. So when the doctor said to me, do you asked me whether I wanted to have my son circumcised or not, my first thought was, that seems like a bad idea. I think we all, if we hadn't been taught otherwise, we would all think that. Most societies are not circumcising societies other than for religious reasons. The US is the only country in the world, well, Israel and South Korea, but hardly, almost the only one that circumcises boys who are perfectly healthy. Elsewhere, they only circumcise them when they need to be circumcised. So in other countries, people are just horrified and astonished that, we would strap down a baby boy and cut off part of the penis. So they're culturally, they
have a different perspective than us.
They have a completely different perspective, but
By the way,
perspective is the truthful one, because the foreskin is a natural body part.
I'm curious, what has been the reception to the legal papers you've written? I'd imagine that within the United States, it might be different than outside the United States, but what has the reaction to that work been?
Well, I mean, in Tactivists, we're sort of all on the same team. So when any of us write an article, we all congratulate each other. And I think so many people have done, really wonderful work in these publications and speeches and activism. So what's the true effect? I think it will take time. But I think, for example, the argument that circumcision is a fraud, there's a website that promotes it. It's not promoted by me, but by a family whose son was injured by circumcision. I think when people realize they've been duped, that they haven't been told the truth, and they are going to flip their perspective. Instead of seeing doctors as the good guys who are trying to help with the health of their children and trying to see them as opportunists who take something from their sons and harm their sons, I would expect them to be very angry. And then
what I'm curious about, though, is if the other legal scholars who read these academic journals have responded to your paper or been persuaded by it or triggered by it or had any kind of reaction to it.
So there's another interesting question, Brendon. So if all these writings by legal scholars could be refuted, we would have heard some arguments trying to refute the arguments of the legal scholars opposed to circumcision 40 years ago. In 1985, William Brigman wrote that circumcision is child abuse, and no one has refuted his view. In 1999, Giannetti, a legal scholar, argued that the American Academy of Pediatrics could be liable for negligence and possible fraud for having issued guidelines that were scientifically untenable and constituted misconduct. The American Academy of Pediatrics did not respond. I wrote my article, "Is Circumcision Illegal?" Nobody responded. Basically, as I see it, there are no defenses. If there were defenses, we would have heard them by now.
So it sounds like there's been a reaction of silence where they don't respond in any way.
Yeah, so another interesting question. So the American Academy of Pediatrics had issued circumcision guidelines continuously since 1971. So for 50 years. and well, almost 2012, they kept revising them. 2012, they issued guidelines that were very pro-circumcision. They tried to deny it, but they were the most pro-circumcision yet. And all the other medical associations, national medical associations, have rejected those guidelines. But the point I'm leading up to is the guidelines expire 5 years later. In 2017, for the first time since 1971, the American Academy of Pediatrics did not issue new guidelines. So I think they had been criticized so soundly by so many people and so effectively that they have nothing left to say. So they've stopped trying to defend themselves because they can't.
Have the other legal scholars who are not involved on this issue had any response to the work that you do? In other words, I'm curious if judges who maybe haven't thought about this issue or lawyers who maybe haven't thought about this issue have seen this and had a reaction to it.
I'm trying to think. We write these papers and sometimes we don't know what the effect is. I've been told that, and it's very gratifying that some of my papers have led parents to decide against having their son circumcised. Certainly, Stephen Svoboda has written 50 to 100 papers. I don't know how many. Prolific scholar and the intellectual leader of the movement. And he's been influential. We cite each other favorably. There haven't been enough lawsuits to know whether we will persuade judges. So you would like to think that justice will be done. I think Martin Luther King said won't get the wording correct, but the arc of history tends toward justice. And as there's more opposition to circumcision, one day people wake up and realize that it's a terrible thing and it's never possible to justify it. And decisions will come down that are, favorable.
So are there any plans to bring lawsuits of any kind based on the work that you've done and that others have done, basically making the argument that circumcision is a fraud or not legal, or at least bringing more botched cases of some kind?
Yeah, so, I think botched cases, if people are really injured, they go to a lawyer and the lawyers do bring suit if they're within the statute of limitations. The first article I wrote is Circumcision Legal. Somebody brought a suit in Florida in federal district court based on the arguments made in my article. There were opening statements. This was in federal court, and the lawyer sensed a great deal of hostility from the judge, and so he withdrew the case. So then I told you one paper I wrote shows that it's unlawful to use Medicaid to pay for circumcision. And there's a longtime opponent of circumcision, Ron Goldman. He's the leading expert on psychological harm caused by circumcision. So he decided to sue the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for using Medicaid to pay for circumcision. And so I'm lead counsel in that case. And we have co-counsel from New Jersey who's very capable. And so in it, we've argued, it's really quite straightforward, 3 steps. First is Medicaid does not pay for unnecessary medical services. Point 2, non-therapeutic circumcision, non-therapeutic elective circumcision is by definition not necessary. And the third prong of our case is that there's a statute in Massachusetts that allows taxpayers to bring suit to stop the state from doing anything unlawful. And so we had hoped that Massachusetts would just stop paying for using Medicaid to pay for circumcisions, but the National Medicaid Association doesn't seem inclined to do that. And hospitals in Boston make huge amounts of money circumcising. So the state opposed, filed a motion to dismiss. We think their arguments are groundless. We have a hearing coming up on February 18, and we'll have to see what happens. So that's an example of a suit based on one of the papers. And so then, actually, I'm better able to answer your question now about has the article, Is Circumcision a Fraud, influenced anyone? So I wrote the article, and somebody heard about it, called me up, spoke to me, and decided to bring suit based on the article. And the article, I mean, the lawsuit is being filed either today or Monday in Superior Court in New Jersey. And it's arguing that circumcision is a fraud. And it's arguing that it's constructive fraud. It's a little hard to explain, but the idea is that the plaintiff doesn't need to prove intentional fraud on the part of the defendant. I should have said the defendant is a medical group and the American Academy of Pediatrics. So it's being sued based on its 1989 guidelines that were in effect when this boy was circumcised.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, that today, February 5th, 2021, because this podcast will probably air later, someone is bringing a suit against the American Academy of Pediatrics on the grounds that their guidelines were fraud, whether or not they were intentional fraud. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. So, my thinking has developed over the years. At first, I was thinking, well, it's unlawful. Then I was thinking, well, it's intentional fraud. There's fraudulent misconduct. They portray it as medicine when it's violence. They claim that parents have the right to decide, and that's a false legal claim. But then I realized this, I just feel fortunate that I had such a great teacher in torts. It was two things that he'd said way back in law school. And what he had said is that physicians have a special responsibility to patients because they have superior knowledge of medicine, whereas lay people don't know anything about it. And therefore, the physician has a duty to act in the best interest of the patient on medical grounds. And the burden is on them to justify all medical procedures. So the consequence, it's a little hard to explain, but a breach of trust is called constructive fraud. Once the claim is made that you, the doctor, took unfair advantage of me, you took something from me that I had a right to keep, the burden falls to the physician and the American Academy of Pediatrics to justify. So this lawsuit claims constructive fraud, that whether the AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics, intended to defraud the public and this particular set of parents or not, they are still liable. And that's very important. So what I would like to see is an avalanche of lawsuits by the hundreds of thousands of men, if not millions, who are unhappy to have had part of their penis cut off for nothing.
So that, especially if it succeeds, seems like a landmark case. Is that correct? That this
yes,
would be...
It would be a landmark case. And it would particularly be, it'd be a landmark case also because the statute of limitations has passed for this plaintiff. So this isn't an especially good plaintiff. In New Jersey, you have 2 years to bring suit for negligence, and more than 2 years have passed. And so what the plaintiff is arguing is that he was defrauded and he didn't discover the fraud until 4 months ago. And as soon as he discovered it, he brought suit. And therefore, the statute of limitations starts now. It isn't over. So if the suit prevails on that, then boys and men who were circumcised more than 21 years ago, or 18, whatever the age of majority is in their state, will still be able to sue when they discover that they've been either intentionally defrauded or taken unfair advantage of.
That would be huge if it began at the point of discovery that you could file a lawsuit rather than a certain number of years past the actual incident of circumcision.
Right, because about 80% of males in the US are circumcised. What are there, 340 million people, so 170 million males, 80% of them, you have 125 million plaintiffs.
So, how did you find this particular plaintiff, or did they find you? How did this case
And,
come together?
they found me because they heard about my article, um, and from the lawyer who's handling it in New Jersey, and we all spoke.
How do you think that this case has a significant chance of being successful? And is there a way that people could learn more about it or support it potentially?
Yeah, that's interesting question. So, once you bring suit, you need to be careful about what you say, but
Sure, I understand
right,
that mid lawsuit you can't tell
right,
me everything, but is there
yeah,
anything that you could share?
but nonetheless, lawsuits are public. So the complaint is being filed, as I said, in the next couple of days. There is a website, Is Circumcision a Fraud? I'm not sure if it's a .com or not. You might know, but anyway, it'd be easy to find if you just type that in all together. And my understanding is that it's run by the parents and the child, now a man who is injured. I believe they're going to publish the filings in the case.
So people will be able to find the actual filings and lawsuit there.
Yes, and there probably will be some statements that go with it. So the short answer is yes, go to Is Circumcision a Fraud, and you can find out the status of the lawsuit. Yes.
That's very exciting. I'm very curious to hear how that goes. And it sounds like too that if there's a way that people could support that particular case, that would be the place to go as well.
Yeah, so interestingly, there's tremendous support for these lawsuits. So for example, Eric Klopper put on a play at Harvard opposed to circumcision. And the administration accused him of being anti-Semitic, which is preposterous because he's Jewish. And so they fired him and he sued Harvard. And he put out a request to fund his lawsuit, and he raised $10,000 in a couple of days. So, if he needed $100,000 to prosecute the lawsuit, I believe he could raise it. And then in the Medicaid lawsuit, Ron Goldman put out a request for funding. I think it's called GoFundMe. And he raised $20,000 without much trouble. So I think there's tremendous support. There's really huge opposition to circumcision, maybe not by the general public, but likely, millions of men.
One of the things that I have heard about these kinds of lawsuits is that even though the case might be strong, the opposition you're up against obviously has significant resources. And I'm certain that the American Academy of Pediatrics, especially since they haven't been able to refute your arguments in the court of public opinion, will want to avoid establishing any kind of case precedent that would allow more of these lawsuits. So, is there anything that you can say about their response or potential response, or what you might expect as a response from this type of lawsuit?
I guess it's hard to say, but they will probably say the statute of limitations has passed, and then we'll say, well, sure, we know that, but the discovery rule applies in every state, including New Jersey. We've done the research, and you're mistaken, and our case can proceed. Then on the intentional fraud claim, they'll probably say, well, we didn't intend, to mislead anybody, et cetera. But I'm not a lawyer on the case, but the plaintiff and the lawyers including David Llewellyn, the circumcision expert. They wouldn't be bringing the case if they didn't think they could prove intentional fraud. And, good luck to them defending the constructive fraud claim. Basically, we say you took unfair advantage of the child, the boy and man and his parents in many ways. You didn't tell the whole truth. Good luck to them trying to defend that. So I think it's a powerful case.
I love the confidence of that reply. Good luck to them. It reminds me a bit of the Southern phrase, bless your heart, which is the way that very polite people tell you you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that you want to add on this subject that I haven't asked about?
No, I'm trying to think. It's been a very thorough interview. I've sort of given a shout out already to some people, but I would like to just build on that. Marilyn Milos is the founder of the movement, is sort of semi-retiring now, but because of her, there's an entire movement, and circumcision, it will end. It's a dying industry. It's a matter of when. So I give her tremendous credit, and she was terminated for opposing circumcision, so she's really paid the price. She's a wonderful person. Stephen Svoboda is, magnificent legal scholar. His work is impeccable. The intellectual father of the movement, I have the highest regard for him. And then Robert Van Houw has just been relentless in opposition. And basically, the entire industry, they all stay together. For example, the pediatric urologists who fix circumcisions that have gone wrong, they know it's a terrible thing. They don't speak out about it. They make a living doing it. So the whole industry, there's hardly anybody speaking out against it. So I really commend Robert Van Houw and also doctors opposing circumcision. And, all the people who are trying to change people's minds and doing a very good job of it. The main problem is that they have to overcome the appearance that doctors give it that circumcision is medicine.
It's a significant challenge, and it sounds like it's one that you're working on now. So I'm very curious to hear how that case goes and the work that you're doing turns out.
Thank you, Brendon. Yeah, and there are, of course, other lawyers handling the case, and we hope for a fair and therefore a good outcome.
Well, thank you for talking with me today, and I look forward to hearing more about how this case goes.
Thanks so much, Brendon, for what you're doing.
Thank you for listening to the Brendon Marotta Show. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone else who would also like it, and then go on whatever platform you listen to the show on and leave a positive review. If you want to support the show directly, go to brendonmarotta.com/show and subscribe there. Paid subscribers get special unreleased bonus material and live events that are only available to them. Once again, that is brendonmarotta.com/show. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all later.